Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion with MyFutureCloud as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight. I work within the Standards Regulatory and Thought Leadership part of RICS, and I lead the RICS Tech Partner Program. And I'm very pleased today to have David from MyFutureCloud with me to have an interesting discussion here around digitization in the built environment. So welcome, David. And I guess to kick off, it'd be lovely to hear about your backstory and skills and experience and MyFutureCloud and how it was set up. So over to you.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. So yeah, where did it all begin? So I'm a commercial and strategy director for MyFutureCloud, and I started my journey many moons ago, almost 20 years ago now, as a business analyst. And it was a job I really enjoyed doing because it gave me a chance to understand, get under the root of businesses, and understand what makes their departments or various operational areas tick. In that time, I started off in a particular sector, which was membership, believe it or not, third sector. And like any not-for-profit organization, it's all about how you make the most of the little budgets that you have. And it was still around what we call today digital transformation, but back then it was always a case of, we need to increase our membership engagement. We need ways to make ourselves more known. So that involved things like digital initiatives around the websites, around the customer relationship management solutions that they had. And I worked on the software side of the fence for some of the largest proprietary systems that were out there. And in a short amount of time, after about 5 years of doing that, I realized that the software industry is changing, and these proprietary systems were being outrun by the likes of Salesforce and Microsoft. And before I knew it, I found myself actually working for Microsoft. Again, extending the technology stack, and still from a technology point of view. And luckily, I then had a chance to branch out into the project management side of the world. And started to work with some consultancies, so like with Avanade through Accenture and so on, and found myself in real estate, the real estate sector. And that's, I think, where the marriage of dealing with the built environment really began. Also worked a lot with financial institutions, the finance and professional services sector, and always coming from this sort of poacher turned gamekeeper, if you like, where I was on the software side, turned to management consultant, and then actually started to work for myself as a contractor, representing the client and then helping them manage these large transformation journeys that they would go on. So it's what I think has morphed into who I am today, which is a person that deals with business change and digital transformation, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, because that means all things to different people.
Well, that's great. And obviously, as you say, you as your career has moved on, you've come into that kind of real estate built environment world. And I know it's a slight cliche to talk about the journey to digitization, but where is the built environment on that journey to digitization? And especially if we have to be fairly honest and compare it to other sectors.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the joys we have working for a management consultancy, where we specialize in real estate, finance, professional services, agriculture, and third sector. So a lot of those areas I talked about. So we often are, doing projects in any of those sectors and able to compare. So I'll start with financial services, because making that comparison to real estate, you're comparing it to one of the forward-thinking sectors that has the money for these large digital programs, where you see transformation at scale, and with various methodologies to help that transformation. That hasn't started just across 1, 2, or even 3 years. They started their digital transformation journey many years ago. And the mistake that other sectors make is they try to compare themselves with these sorts of financial institutions who, are very mature when it comes to their levels of digital transformation. And having said that, in real estate, what I found is that there are lots of pockets for innovation. There are lots of mature partners that work, without trying to name a few, but
Hmm.
you only need to look at the Gartner quadrant. I've got to be
Yeah.
careful here not to pay homage to any of them, but you look at the Gartner quadrant, and you see some of the big players out there that are boasting of technologies, and not just the technology, but also the process maturity within real estate that compares to the likes of what Microsoft, Salesforce are doing in other
Hmm.
areas. Um, and yet people still cry about the lack of digital or digitization within real estate. So I think that question really needs to be scrutinized. And I think when you look under the cover, you will probably find that it's because real estate, unlike probably any of the other sectors, is so fragmented when you look at the design, build, maintenance side of the fence, and you look at the various different owners of data across those pockets, that for you to try and find a one size fits all enterprise solution across that whole bracket, we could be here on days just talking about how you can level up the technology and the processes and people along that journey in the real estate sector.
So I suppose that the key takeaway from that is fragmentation in a number of dimensions. A, that the market within real estate is so fragmented, and so there are so many different players with very different levels of maturity, and then indeed processes and data because of that are fragmented. So you've almost got almost the worst place to start, where you have a very fragmented industry in total, and then you have data and processes that are, by virtue of that, are very fragmented. But I suppose the optimistic note, as you say, is there are certain pockets within the sector that are very mature in terms of digitization, but because of that underlying fragmentation, we have a huge range of maturity where arguably
Mhm.
certain players are still very, very backwards, if I can use that slightly pejorative term.
Yeah, precisely that. I mean, if you were to think about, just take one example, if you were looking at an organization that has, lots of assets, and I mean by assets, I mean real estate type
Mm,
assets. So that brings into question a asset management, maintenance management, and so on. But within that same organization, you could have a sales team that's responsible for selling those assets. And so before you know it, you're looking at a sales and marketing engine that needs to relate to a property management solution, that also needs to relate to a CAFM, a computer aided facility management
mm,
solution. And then when you look at the market to see what's out there, to see, well, is there a solution that covers all of those four or three or four angles? You may struggle to find that. What you find is a solution that's grown very organically, maybe in the FM sector,
mm,
that isn't so mature on the property management side, and is even less so on the sales and marketing elements. And we're not even touching other areas like HR and
mm.
these. And these are all things that have to happen within
Yeah.
a very large global business. And if you compare that to, say, a finance, a bank, for example, you will find out that there are larger enterprise solutions that can cater for all of those different elements. And so if you're looking at digital transformation in a bank, the way you would approach that could be easier because the data that you're dealing with, the amounts of siloed areas are probably less because you have an
Mm.
enterprise solution that deals with that. And yet, if you were to compare that to a real estate business that has pretty much one solution, or probably even two in some cases, for each of those areas, it's a lot harder to
So
manage
I mean,
that change.
if I was in the position of running a real estate firm that was at that start of that journey, but I knew that we needed to digitize, what's the art of the possible? I mean, where do you start? How can you actually begin that journey in a way that produces some reasonably immediate returns,
Yeah.
and that you don't, to use the phrase, that try and boil the ocean almost?
Yeah, so it's when I used to work for Accenture, that was a really it was an easy thing for us because a lot of the C-level suite will come saying, look, we just need your kind of approval to have a look at what we're looking to do strategically. And if it goes wrong, or we end up spending millions and this whole thing goes wrong, then it's the sort of, well, if one of the big four looked at this and we still couldn't get it right, then it's not, our heads aren't on the chopping block. um, Now I work, I'm no longer with the big four. It's still that big four thinking though, where what we do sometimes at MFC is we pick up some of the briefs where a large piece of discovery might have been done for this large organization, where it's been said you're going to have to spend £5 to £10 million. There was one of the airport conglomerates that we had to do this with recently, and it was looking at their whole maintenance elements. One of the big four had been in and said it's going to cost you about £5 million to do this, but they weren't prepared to spend that much amount of money. And then when we looked at it, it was a question of, well, actually, this is what we've heard, and this is how you would go about breaking this down, and breaking it into the various chunks, and making sure you have the right resources to do it. So a lot of the times what we find is that it really comes down to the why. Why are you looking to do this? Have you already done a discovery piece internally or outsourced that piece of work? Do you understand why you want to do it before you then go on to the how you're going to do it? And often that's the hard bit, because people don't know how to stand up a team, bringing the right level of expertise. And at the same time, how do you marry up, especially when it comes to change? Who are those change agents within the organization that are going to act as your ambassadors for this change that's coming, that's going to deal with the fear factor that comes along with change? We call it FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But also, how do you get the technical elements that are responsible for that change? So this is where we're talking about the developers, the engineers, the solution architects. How do you get them to talk to the actual business owners, some of those managers, directors, to understand that the business objective or the business case that was derived in the beginning stays true throughout the development of the product, whatever that end product is, or whatever those end goals are? How do you stay true to making sure that the return on investment carries over the benefits that were brought about during that discovery piece? And that's where you really find you're going into the real trenches through any transformation program, to make sure you stay true to that journey and also react to changes that come across.
Right. I mean, you've just really kind of highlighted and distilled that I suppose that classic issue of change management and making a business case and getting the sort of monetary resources made available. I mean, in terms of actual barriers, once you overcome those, either within a firm or more broadly for the sector, what do you think are the main barriers to digitization? I was reading a survey this morning by a prop tech firm that highlighted that they felt that technical skills within the built environment was a huge barrier. But what other kind of things, whether it's around data or governance or interoperability, what other barriers are there that are stopping people, even if they've made the good case, they've got a team together, they've got the C-level buy-in, and they've put appropriate resource behind it, whether that's people and or funds? What are those other barriers that you're bumping into that are hindering this journey?
Yeah, there's so many barriers that come to mind, but I guess the easiest way to distill it down is if we were to break it into those three pots within digital transformation around people, process, and technology, right? Let's just focus on people to start with. So the biggest barrier we find there, or I find, is at the leadership. It's within the leadership team. So it's about how do you transform or translate that vision to the people on the ground who are actually going to be the ones experiencing the change, right? And what I find is you do have some, depends on the experience as well of the leaders, where they have a very clear vision as to what they want, but how they're able to incentivize and get people powered up and make sure that they're protected to do the job. By protected, I mean they have the space, the brain power to think and not be bogged down by the manual administrative tasks, which is the whole probable reason why you're doing the change in some cases.
Yeah.
That's right. And often you may find that the ones that struggle are either those leaders who haven't experienced this level of change before. They've never gone through that transformation journey. So they don't really know what to expect, the forward thinking in that, guys. A good example is one where I was working with a client where the chief operating officer left for whatever reason. And so there was a big gap. And this is someone who was so instrumental to how this business was going to be formed. It was sort of a startup business, but one funded to the tunes of billions. And so far, in his absence, what was felt was a lack of consensus. It was, there were lots of process maps about how things were supposed to work, but the people that were left behind hadn't had the sort of experience that he's had over 30 years to address the unhappy path, because what those process flows give you is the happy path as to, yes, you do this, 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 and the services will be delivered by this way. However, when you actually go to implement it, it's a completely different story about that 20% of those anomalies, which actually cause you probably the 80% amount of pain that you get if you don't do it right. So leadership is a big one when it comes to people, in terms of making sure that the leaders are experienced about the transformation, that they make sure that their teams are well supported. And then I guess if you come onto the process side of that same story, getting your processes right, often what these large programs or even medium-sized programs expose is that there needs to be, this is probably the first time that different departments within an organization are going to sit around the table to talk about a true end-to-end process. So if you were to go back to that example I gave in the beginning about sales and marketing, selling a property, right through to the ownership of the property, right through to those that manage the maintenance of said property, all within one organization, and you're about to replace or enhance their processes, then through that digital transformation program, you will probably find this is the first time you get a stakeholder from sales and marketing, a stakeholder from the FM side, and a stakeholder from the operations side. And they then get to understand that, when you send me this report, this is why you need it in this format. I didn't know that. Well, if that's the case, yeah, we can do it this way. We can create a dashboard that everyone has immediate insights to. And the little changes I make in my world, I now understand the impact that has for the wider good of the business. So those processes sometimes are not, shall we say, again, well thought through in terms of, making sure you bring the real players to the table, making sure you give them a level of empowerment to make certain decisions, and decisions above a certain threshold, which often affects the bottom line, especially financially, need to be escalated. Again, putting that structure in place for the processes to breathe, and people can be really free and not scared about, oh, well, if I make a mistake, I could lose my job. Again, that's a real challenge. And then last but not least, I guess, if we're looking at the technology side, and it's probably one of the easiest ones that gets a hard time most of the time, is the technology. And again, having worked on both sides of the fence, one thing I do know is that I think the technology guys do have a hard remit. They have a hard time because by the time they come to the table, the client is supposed to have known what it is that they want. They're supposed to have had a fully fledged business case, and they go, right, they should know how much it's going to cost them, right? But actually, that's not always the case. The business changes. The business case is organic. It's always changing. Gone are the days of this sort of old waterfall approach where the budget's been signed off, we've got a full functional spec, nothing's allowed to change, and if anything changes, that's more money, so no one wants to hear about change, everyone's scared of that. And the reality is, when the software provider comes to the table, is that it's all of those, the devil in the detail, when they now look under the bonnet to start replacing a system and taking the data from one place to another, they realize, actually, it's not that straightforward. Or the client now discovers that, now that I understand how my world's going to work in your system with all of these added benefits, how about some of the good old stuff I used to have in the old system and old ways of working? That's all changed. So there's now what I call discovered requirements, which again, dare mention that, and you're talking change requests because no one thought about those discovered requirements right at the start. So vendors do get a tough time that sometimes they don't have the chance to form those relationships with clients at the early stages when they're doing that discovery piece. And they only come in at a very late stage where they're just being told what to do. And by the time they now try to suggest anything else, the delivery guy on the software side of the fence is really met with a lot of resistance because his sales person has sold a dream about what their software will do. And this delivery guy has to deliver this nightmare now and make it work. So yeah, I don't know if that helps a little bit, but that's kind of my 2 cents.
No, and there's some few points I'd love to pick up on actually. One of which, I mean, and I know it's a slight cliche, but do you find people are still not using the opportunity of looking at processes to be quite um, humble about changing their processes and recognizing that actually just because they've done it that way for years, that actually this is an opportunity to have a very long, hard look at processes and value add and say, well, actually, why are we doing that? And also let's go with the flow of the technology and not enforce archaic processes on and end up with customization and that kind of thing. So I'm interested, are people getting more open to that idea of, well, this is a big
Mm,
opportunity to actually look at our end-to-end processes and be very
mm,
brutal in a good, positive way about stripping out
mm,
inefficient processes that aren't adding any value and really streamlining and not forcing so much customization on systems that you end up in
mm.
that bad situation of systems that are hard to maintain.
Are people getting more open? Are people getting more better at doing that and having those conversations? I think one of the things my 20 years of doing this has definitely shown is that that is probably one area that has not changed one iota. No, because, and I'll tell you why, it's because you're still just dealing with people,
Yeah.
and that's just based on people's experiences. So you might be lucky that you're on a project where some of the people involved have worked in other organizations of a similar like to where they are and have worked in different ways that they can bring that to the table and say to you, well, our processes here are quite rigid. And in fact, they've been forced to be this way because the solutions you have are not fit for purpose. So people have found workarounds that have now become the actual process,
Mm.
and they can challenge the status quo. Having said that, you could be on another project where you have less people that have worked in a better place than where they are. All they've known their whole lives is where they are. So change is obviously going to be harder for them
Mm.
to visualize the new world. And what I often say to people when you're going through any program, be it digital or just business change, is try just to keep it simple and just keep it down to your processes. What do you want to improve about your process? Do you want to make it more streamlined? Do you want to make it more about the customer? What are the things? How do you increase the value that that particular service delivers, right? And try not to think about solutions because everyone's so quick to go, well, if we get a new system,
Yeah.
we can automate this and do that. But there's nothing worse than automating a bad process. So why I say that hasn't changed one bit in all this time in terms of how people are now thinking more clearly. The closest change I would say is that you hear a lot now these days, a lot more about agile and agile ways of working. But again, that comes with its own challenges because agile means different things to different people. And it's only
Mm.
as good as anyone that's worked in a real agile environment where they saw the benefits of it, that they can then really try and bring that home to where they are. So I don't think it has changed much in terms of the processes and people being more open. I just think that there are, a lot of it is down to, I think it comes to leadership, that if as an organization you try to hire what I call knowledge workers, a knowledge worker is someone who actually knows more about what they do than their boss. It's a bit like hiring a chess player and then you're telling them
Yeah.
what move to make. No, if you hire a chess player, it's like, okay, can you win the game? Do what you got to do, use
Yeah.
your strategy, exactly. And organizations that are forward thinking like that they make sure they hire people to get the job done rather than give them a task list and say, you must do these things. You must be at your computer at 9 a.m. in the morning and finish at 5, do nothing else. Those are the organizations that are more forward thinking and create that environment for those thinkers to come to the table to solve a solution based on their experiences that they've had before. So I think leadership is a key thing to trying to address that question.
Now, David, you mentioned agile. Are you an advocate of the kind of sprint scrum approach to kind of try and deliver, blocks of work quickly and produce lots of outcomes rather than sort of disappearing into a darkened room for a year and coming back and going, ta-da?
Yeah. I'm nodding my head only in jest because it doesn't mean yes. Actually, for that one, it really depends on the type of project. So Agile is pretty good for software projects because in many instances you're looking to build something new
Mm.
and react to changes because businesses move really fast these days. So the speed at which decisions need to be made today is very different to how it was 5 years ago, right? Because you're always trying to beat the next player who's coming to market with another product or similar product. So it's about who gets there first. Having said that, if you were in the pharmaceutical industry, where things have to be tried and tested, right? And you need to go through those various steps of quality control, then that whole sort of iterative, we'll try doing this thing but in different ways, is probably not as accommodating for that. Now, having said that, we've just been hit by a pandemic, and with the vaccination, believe it or not, they used some of the most intricate agile practices that you could ever come across. And what people don't realize is that agile is very expensive. So to give you an example, in agile, what you would do in the finance sector is you can afford to have 3 teams looking to build the same product, and so that you're in a position to go, well, this product, I like it, but it doesn't really work, scrap it. But this one, I do like your ideas you're coming up with here, keep going, and so on and so forth. That's an agile approach. It's iterative, you're allowed to change, you're allowed to pivot, change is not such a negative thing. And that's what they did with the vaccines, where they had different variants and different variations of that being made with budgets to say, well, try that one, try this one, try that one, go for whatever works. That's an agile methodology. So there's a very good way that you can actually mix your old waterfall with agile, often coined as wagile. Again, it just comes back to your experience. When do you use those waterfall things? It's usually around the governance, the early stages, making sure you get the governance right, get things documented to a certain degree, but not too much, and then you go off and develop iteratively. So does that answer the question? It wasn't a direct yes, I know, but
no, it does. No, I guess it's horses for courses, to use that phrase, isn't it? That the one has to have a sort of a toolkit of approaches depending on the project. But one last piece around that barrier piece is we've almost sort of focused on arguably barriers within an organization and how you minimize those and the approaches you use. Given the fragmented nature of the real estate market, and to use the phrase that, no firm is an island, what are the barriers that people are bumping into when they digitize? Because they're clearly part of a supply chain, they're part of that broader ecosystem in real estate, which is so fragmented. What are the barriers that people bump into when they say, well, okay, we can do this internally, but we're now having to deal with other vendors and suppliers and clients and data flows, and what are those things that people are bumping into that make it hard to digitize in isolation when you have to digitize as part of a marketplace?
So that's a good question, that one. I guess for that, one could start with, there's 2 angles to it. One is governance, and the other is technology. So if I start with technology, with the technology angle, it used to be in the old days, for you to integrate to other things or work with was a lot harder until you started to talk about APIs that could help with that. But also on the technology side, you have a fundamental question to ask at the beginning of any journey, which is, are you looking to go down an integrated route where you have maybe you limit the amount of solutions that you're looking for, but still look to integrate? Or are you going down an enterprise route, which is you go for a one-size-fits-all solution that has all of the different modules to represent either the different departments or areas of the business, and you look to develop it? And you've just got to understand the pros and cons, because neither of them are bad necessarily, but you've got to know what fits your organization better. So if it's a very large organization that will bring in, a big consultancy and say, look, we want to change our underlying platform, that's a huge transformation. You're talking 3, even 5 years to do that. But then you've got to understand, where do you start? Do you start on the sales and marketing side? Do you start with the core mission critical solutions? And if you do, within that enterprise solution, it's still going to have its strengths and its weaknesses, areas where that enterprise solution grew organically and areas where it's not so good. And maybe in those areas that it's not so good, it could be a HR element of it. You might outsource or integrate to a better HR tool that has known integrations to it. So that's the technology front to that question. And businesses often have that challenge where they haven't thought about that journey. They haven't thought strategically about how they do this. There's a sort of fumble in the weeds and say, oh yes, there's this fantastic solution. We did a procurement and we came up for that particular department. This is the best, but they haven't thought about how other departments will interact with that solution, particularly if it's a mission critical solution for the organization. And if they haven't done that, you're only just saving up troubles for later on. They're just kicking that can further down the road, right? So you really need to think, and that's where the second part, governance, comes into play, because then you're starting to think like a mature business, where you're thinking, cross-divisionally. We've gone through this before, and we recognize the pains we went through when we didn't think about that. We've got lessons learned that now means if you're doing this, let's say in the operations team, does finance know about this? What's the impact on finance? There's a lot that goes on in operations where purchase orders need to be raised, invoices need to be paid. You don't want to let your suppliers down with late payments. You don't want to let the service user down. So how does that all affect the customer? So finance is a big piece. The operational piece is big. So's sales and marketing, so's HR. So let's get all of these people thinking about what the change in just the operational piece would mean to other departments within the business. So that's the governance piece and making sure that you really think these things through. And again, that's a very common barrier we come across, because sometimes you might be dealing with a stakeholder that's around operations, but you don't have a very good handle on a stakeholder in finance or a stakeholder in other departments, and they're not really bought into what that change could mean for them. And sometimes they don't even care because they're just too busy. They've got too much going on. So it's like, okay, yeah, the COO is doing some stuff over there. I've got my own HR issues to deal with. Don't really want to know. And it's probably the job of the CEO or someone more central to bring all of these C-level guys together and explain what the journey will be and the corporate direction. It's all about coming back to your corporate plan and how those mini plans fit into it.
So David, I'm sure you've got some great case studies in your sort of virtual back pocket, and obviously without naming names and protecting the innocent, can you bring to life a couple of instances, particularly in the built environment, where digitization has either worked incredibly well or has had some challenges, and what that can bring as experience and lessons for the people listening to this conversation?
Yeah, sure. Where should we start? So let's go with a facility management company that was in charge of about 700 buildings, and all of a sudden decided to change its system because it was coming to end of life, end of support. So it was a pretty good reason. And bottom line is, I was brought in to have a look at it strategically, and quickly realized that it was owned by a brother company who was the property management side of the business, and they set up the sister company to handle the facility management of all said properties. And the first thing I did was to look at the systems that they shared between them, and they had about 13 systems shared between them. And the next thing was to decide, well, are you still going to go on together or kind of separate? And they decided, okay, no, we just want to focus on us as a business, for which they had 4 critical systems around the FM, the facility management piece. So the idea was to find a consolidated solution for that. So we went to market, looked at some of the best of the best, did a beauty parade, went to about 7 vendors, we chose one. And the final chosen was based on not costs, actually, because it was quite an expensive solution that they went for, but it was more about scalability, how that solution can grow with the business and their changes. And it was quite a large business, and we then set off on that transformation journey. But what was good about that is that they spent a lot of time in the early stage really trying to figure out, there were about 7 departments involved in this, right through from help desk, operations, facility managers, regional operators, auditors, compliance, you name it. They were all a part of this, and they really thought hard about, there were some departments that were actually doing okay. They didn't want change, didn't want a new system. They loved their system. So it was all about trying to get them to buy into the idea of the greater good. Why you need to have one solution. You don't want a solution where, from an FM point of view, you've got a asset management and work management solution where an engineer goes off and repairs a lift, but then you've got a separate solution that handles compliance. And when said lift is put back into operation, guess what? Its warranty has run out, and that's handled in the compliance system. Someone can go to jail based on that decision, because all of the operational guys have ticked off that lift to go back into operation, but it's actually out of warranty. If there's an accident, you know the rest. So we had to sell to the compliance team. There was a big job of getting them to really pry them away from their lovely system to go into this enterprise solution, so that there's that communication between all systems. Anyway, cut long story short, project ran on for 12 months. And the last month of going live, guess what they did? They purchased a new engineering firm. 200 engineers, 2 feet across, none of their requirements captured, but we still had to go live. So the interesting thing with that scenario or case study really was all about how you manage change. And there are some instances where even if you give the best advice as to why it might not be a good idea to go live, there are business reasons. I think for this case, there were some cash incentives that if they completed the merger by a certain date
Yeah.
before Christmas, it's all good to go. So that's what we had to do. And in that scenario, it was about just getting your fireman's jacket on, because it meant actually going into a live operation with this new enterprise solution with um, requirements that hadn't been thought through for how the engineers will react to jobs, feed those jobs back into the solution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we ended up staying on for another 7 months, which is probably good for a consultancy, but it's probably where I lost some of the lovely hair there. 7 months I'll never get back. So that's just one case study within real estate. Another one I could think of is one that deals more with data and how you can commoditize data. And so we work with a vendor to really understand how they could uncouple themselves from the data that they rent. And this is a very profitable arm of the business that contributes almost 40% to their EBITDA. How they can uncouple themselves from that without being held to ransom by the supplier, who actually is also a competitor. So you can imagine the intricacies of that and how for that's definitely one that needs to remain
Anonymous, yeah.
anonymous for sure. But again, in that instance, it was about replatforming. So removing one platform onto another, whilst dealing with those very sensitive ideas that if another gets wind of this, the implications that could have of just ripping that business and removing their most expensive division within the department, within that business. So that was one that was based on risk. That project was done to remove the risk of not being so heavily reliant and also get back control. There was nothing that stops that organization from now being able to sell their data to someone else, as well as use that data to generate business. So this is where I guess I see instances where what's the reason you're doing a project for? Is it just for that new shiny tool of new technology, or is it to reduce your risk? Is it to increase efficiencies? And that's where you really need to really leverage the expertise of a tried and tested approach to these things.
Yeah, great, David. I suppose to close off our conversation, because this has been fascinating, I'm intrigued to know what sort of, are you seeing an increase in the appetite now for digitization? Are there any market trends driving this? I mean, I see and I hear and I have a lot of conversations about the whole ESG drive in terms of getting data around assets. But what trends are you seeing, and what's the mood music in the market for real estate firms looking to digitize?
Yeah, it's huge. It's always growing. It's just going up and up and up. There's the recent study by McKinsey that says about 50% of jobs are going to be automated by 2025, I think it was. But those trends have always been going upwards. And that's purely because, I mean, you would know this from a RICS point of view. If you were looking at surveyors, even the job of a surveyor now, there's so much of that can be automated. It's all about decision making. If you're looking at cost estimates on large scale projects, how you can have smart contracts without going into the nuts and bolts of all of that. So the trend would always be an upward trajectory because it's a digital age as much as we had the industrial age, whereby even the guy on the street with selling the big issue has a PDF machine for you to pay for it. Guess what? It's instantaneous. So why wouldn't that affect the built environment even more so? So it's only going to go in one direction. The trends I'm seeing definitely are not just in real estate. It's the same that applies in the legal sector where the paralegals are being reduced. Why? Or businesses are losing, law firms are losing out to others because they're doing the work in half amount of time with less people because they're leveraging technology and so on. So it's the same for real estate. And those two are very tightly wedded when it comes to purchases of properties and things like that within the legal and real estate. And the data you get during a conveyance or property deal is still so archaic that needs to be brought up to speed. You've got other sectors crying for the real estate to get up to speed because it's actually weighing them down. So that's only going to be on the increase, particularly with what we've just gone through, where you're trying to do more with less. and therefore leveraging on technology. So you free up people to be more about adding value through the thinking process, freeing them up to actually make sure that the client gets the best of what they want. And then there's also the client demand as well from that, where clients are just more savvy now. They're demanding more.
Yeah.
So those are all fuels for that, I think.
Indeed. Well, it's been fascinating as ever to chat to you, David, and I look forward to our next session where I think we'll go into some more detail about some of these themes. So, suffice us to say, thanks ever so much. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to picking up on these themes again, David.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
And yeah, look forward to the next one.
Indeed. Bye bye now.
Cheers. Bye.